Hi, I'm Julia, and I'm going to be talking about depression in the book The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And yeah, let's get to it. So, I want to give you a bit of background context about the book itself. The protagonist is Esther Greenwood, and she's a smart young woman who attends a women's college. And she won a fashion magazine contest, which allows her to spend a month in New York City during the summer underneath the supervision of a fashion magazine editor. And we learn pretty quickly that Esther has a history of consistent depression. I speculate that she suffered from persistent depressive disorder because, you know, there were no prior suicide attempts, and it was less severe, but at some point she said that she was never happy since she was 9 years old, and that's a really long period of time to feel unhappy for, and so that makes me think that it may be persistent depressive disorder. Um, but the plot really thickens when Esther experiences mental deterioration while in New York City for the summer. And I want to get into potential diagnosis considering this information. So I believe that Esther had, or the character has, major depressive disorder. And I don't want to bore you too much with the details because I know we've gone over this in class, but this involves symptoms that co occur for at least 2 weeks and cause significant distress or impairment in functioning. Um, and core symptoms are feeling down or depressed, or experiencing loss of interest in typically enjoyed things. And you can look at the other couple of examples of symptoms that may, suggest major depressive disorder. I'll get into it in a moment, but Esther has exemplified nearly every single one of these symptoms. So, the reasoning I believe Esther has major depressive disorder is that she has a depressed mood. She has diminished interest or pleasure in almost all activities. And with those two, since they're so major, I'll show you examples and excerpts in a second. She also experiences insomnia and hypersomnia. And I'll give you just a brief fact here, which is at one point she is unable to sleep for an entire month. She simply just can't fall asleep. This is like insane insomnia. She also has fatigue and loss of energy. Early on in the book, she finds it really hard to leave her hotel room to do all of the group activities because she just wants to lay in bed and she just can't muster like the energy. She also feels worthless and a strong sense of guilt. Um, she feels worthless because she doesn't think she's successful or a good writer anymore. And her guilt is largely surrounding the fact that her mother has worked so hard to, financially provide for her and be there for her, and she feels like she's kind of like a bum, for lack of a better word. She also exhibits a diminished ability to concentrate and indecisiveness. At one point, she can't figure out what to do with her time, and she kind of goes through her entire wardrobe and looks at her clothes and then just kind of sits there. So she's unable to decide what to wear. And then she also actually attempts suicide toward the end of the book, and that's a really strong indicator of major depressive disorder. Um, and so I've included a couple quotes for exhibiting the depressed mood and the loss of interest in typically enjoyed activities. The first quote is about depressed mood, and Plath wrote about Esther that only I wasn't steering anything, not even myself. I just bumped from my hotel to work and to parties and from parties to my hotel and back to work, like a numb trolley bus. I guess I should have been excited the way most of the other girls were, but I couldn't get myself to react. I felt very still and very empty, the way the eye of a tornado must feel, moving dully along in the middle of the surrounding hullabaloo. And I think this pretty clearly is an example of a depressed mood. She's not excited about all these things that are going on every day. The parties aren't really sparking joy. She felt kind of stuck in a cycle and a loop of negativity. Additionally, she writes, I knew perfectly well the cars were making a noise, and the people in them and behind the lit windows of the buildings were making a noise, and the river was making a noise, but I couldn't hear a thing. The city hung in my window, flat as a poster, glittering and blinking, but it might just as well not have been there at all, for the good it did me. So here she knows that life is exciting for other people. She knows that the city is bustling and people are having a great time. She's just unable to feel that way herself. And this is another example of depressed mood. Now I want to get into examples of diminished interest in activities. Specifically in this quote, I'll point out how stupid I'd been to buy all those uncomfortable, expensive clothes, hanging limp as fish in my closet, and how all the little successes I totted up so happily at college fizzled to nothing outside the slick marble and plate glass fronts along Madison Avenue. I was supposed to be having the time of my life. And I think what's really noteworthy here is that she was happy about her successes even in college, despite the fact that she wasn't happy since she was 9. At least she was able to feel proud in some way about her accomplishments when she was in college, but now during the summer when she has this deterioration, she really isn't as interested or excited about anything, not even her own success, and not even the fact that she's in New York City. And I don't know if I have time to read this one out loud, but she's kind of just talking about how she wasn't happy since she was 9 years old, and even though her mom, bought all these experiences for her, saved up so that she could go to watercolor and dancing lessons, she was still unhappy. As I've mentioned, I do believe that Esther also has a pessimistic attributional style, and I think that Esther has every single thinking error demonstrated, except for maybe personalization. And all this information is from the Beck Institute article that we read for class one day. And I think that it's really alarming that Esther exhibits so many of these thinking errors, and this will come up later on in my recommendations for an alternative treatment. But first I want to talk about a connection to Andrew Solomon's article about depression. Specifically, the metaphor that he uses about a tree being covered by a vine and the vine kind of, bringing the tree down or kind of like encompassing the tree until the tree is more vine than tree, and you're not really sure where one or the other starts or ends. And this is kind of a parallel, in my opinion, to the bell jar metaphor. And I've quoted an author on Goodreads who wrote, "The bell jar is a metaphor for her depression. It covers her, keeps her isolated from the world, and distorts her view of life." And this reminded me of a quote from the book itself on page 147, which where Esther writes, "It was as if what I wanted to kill wasn't in that skin or the thin blue pulse that jumped under my thumb, but somewhere else, deeper, more secret, and a whole lot harder to get at." So she's not actually wanting to die necessarily, or whatever she wants to get rid of. It isn't herself. It's this deep, deep depression, but she can't determine where one starts and where one ends, just like the tree with the vine. And briefly, I'll touch on the treatment that they do in the book itself. Esther experiences shock treatment, and her mother recommends also that she gets her mind off of her own problems through volunteering at a hospital. And I do believe that that is a helpful tip, but her mother has a stark lack of empathy and has difficulty understanding that Esther wasn't, just choosing to be depressed, that it was just happening to her. So if I were her psychologist, I would recommend a couple different things. I would suggest that Esther get on SSRIs due to the severity of her symptoms and the fact that she attempted suicide. And for similar reasoning, I would suggest transcranial magnetic stimulation due to the severity of her condition. And then for non-biological treatments, I would definitely suggest that Esther undergoes cognitive therapy because of the fact that she exhibits almost every single one of the thinking errors. And I would also suggest interpersonal therapy because Esther's relationship with her mother, with her friends, and with men in her life, it's very lacking. And I want to talk briefly about why she may have developed depression. So her German father had a kind of bleak upbringing, and that may have induced depression in him, which, as we know, passes down a genetic risk. Additionally, there's the personal stressor and sort of trauma of the fact that her father died when she was just 9, and this closely correlates with the age at which she stopped feeling joy. Also, her interpersonal relationships, as I've mentioned, are very lacking, and having poor interpersonal relationships is a risk factor for depression. And she also exhibits a pessimistic attributional style, which is also a risk factor for depression. And here's my reflection. I think I'm running out of time, and I don't want to bore you too much with it, but I did have an interesting time identifying thinking errors in actual examples as opposed to just in theory. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Yeah.